So once as a kid, I was at my grandparents' place in Shepparton, and I'd been talking to my parents and playing inside, and they thought it was time I probably went outside and dug a hole, and that's what they suggested. I should dig a hole in the backyard, see how deep I could make it. I would be devoid of their company and them of mine, but that seemed to be a price they were prepared to pay. So I went in the backyard, and with my matchbox front-end loader, I started digging a hole under the lemon tree. Progress was pretty slow, and very quickly my brother and sister gave up on the endeavour when they realised it was going to be more than 5 minutes worth of work. Fairly typical. They were younger than me, to be fair, and the project lacks some sort of defined objectives. Dug and dug and dug, and I made a surprisingly deep hole. And my grandfather came out and he said to me, if you dig deep enough, you can actually get to China. And I thought, he's a nice old guy, but he really does have some strange gaps in his knowledge of geography. Because surely if you go straight through the Earth, you'll end up like in the northern hemisphere on the opposite side of the planet to China. You'll be further away from China than when you start. And you'll be probably in the North Atlantic and you'll drown. So it's not a good idea. And as a 7-year-old, I wasn't sure how I was going to deal with the Earth's core because it's magma. But anyway, I digress. I dug about this deep and I found a pipe that I assumed was old and just in the way. So I started to try and cut it with an axe I found in the shed. And that was the last I was allowed to dig in the backyard at Grandma's place. But it does beg the question, if you've got half a day and you've got a small matchbox front-end loader, you can dig a hole this deep. How deep can you go if you've got lots of resources? Specifically, if you're living in 1900, you have a mining company, you have access to money, you have reasons to dig down deep, and you have access to engineering expertise, mechanical expertise, how far can you go? Well, this is the right town to ask that question, because there's 2 mines in Bendigo in its history that have both held the title of the deepest mine shaft in the world. And this is their story. I'm Ben. This is my audio. So when they first discovered gold in the Bendigo goldfield, it was literally found in along the creek. The story goes they were washing some clothes in the creek, there were flecks of gold there. The first gold rush and the first miners here weren't really miners, they were just filtering for gold in the soil. So they go through the waterways, they dig pits, they'd use panning, separation, cradle techniques to get those little free-floating fragments of gold out of the soil. That sustained a gold rush for a few years, but the easy to get to gold sort of started to dry up after a little while. What they realised, and really only rockologists understand why, but in Bendigo, as in some other parts of Victoria, there was lots of gold trapped in quartz reefs, in lines of quartz. So you could break that quartz up, you could extract the gold. It was hard work, but with time they developed techniques for doing it better and better. And what we've got here, I'm at the bush at the top of Sunrise Gully, going this way and through this way, is the remains of an open cut mine. So what would have been happening here is there would have been a quartz reef very, very close to the surface. It was probably visible at some point right at the top here, and they've just dug it out to expose it, to break the gold out of it, process it. If we wander around, we'll probably see some traces of it. We'll have a look in a sec. But after they got some of this gold, they realised some of these reefs extended deeper underground, and they started following them. And what they found in Bendigo in particular was there was lots and lots of gold-bearing quartz deep underground. So let's go have a look. So it's really hard to understate how much quartz mining went on in the Bendigo goldfield in the historic mining period between the 1850s and the 1930s. They reckon there's around 6,000 identified mine shafts in this area, and that's not the Bendigo district, that's actually a relatively small area, which was actually the Bendigo goldfield. Basically we consider Bendigo, Long Gully, Ironbark, Eaglehawk and Golden Square. The rest of Bendigo doesn't even count on that, and the surrounding goldfields, which we think of as part of Bendigo, weren't part of that field. 6,000 in that small area. As we've talked about before, the gold lay in these reef lines that run sort of across that area in a sort of almost parallel angle. In some parts they're quite close together. The reef we're looking at in particular for these two mines that we're going to talk about in a minute is the New Chum Reef. It's called the New Chum Reef because there was a chum reef, and I don't actually know how the chum reef got its name. They started digging out and they found there was another deeper reef right next to it, so it became New Chum and Old Chum. The New Chum Reef was particularly famous for its deep level quartz mining, in much the same way Hustler's Reef had been. It's quite amazing just how much material came out of this reef, but we'll talk about that more later. So this is a GeoVic map, and this is the Bendigo goldfield which we're talking about. And you can use this to show the extent of the mapping, because a lot of the old mines are mapped on this. There's a lot of things you can actually look up on this, but if you want to look at mining, we can select under minerals in the menu, add mines, historical mining activity, operating gold mines, deep leads and working details, and hit apply. And it superimposes it over the top. Now, the bigger mines are all named in there, and the smaller crosses are mining activities. So you can see how much there is in this thing. These are the lines of the reefs. You can see that basically the mining activity follows these reefs. This is Great Extended Hustler, which we talked about in another video. And I think ours is probably this line here. This is the New Chum line of reef, if I'm not mistaken. And if you go in closer, these individual crosses are actually individual mine sites, and you can see there's literally thousands of them. Yeah, it's quite amazing. 6,000 mines in quite a small area, and very little trace of them today, basically. And here we are. New Chum Railway mine was named because basically it was on the New Chum Reef and it was next to the railway line. Very creative. Up through here is Golden Gully. The creek comes through under here, under the road. And this is it. This is the side of the mine. There's actually not a lot to see here. So we've got some footings here, right? So you see these brickworks with the threaded rods built into them. These are footings for machinery. So this would have been custom built for a particular machine. Machine would have sat as top and bolted down to these rods that are built into the mortar. You can see archways through here, which is kind of cool. I'm not an expert in these things, and I'd love to hear people's opinions. My theory would actually be that this might be a winch drum. So you see there's a gap and there's a depression down in there. And I wonder if there's a big round winch that sort of drum around here. And the piston that ran it maybe was mounted up here to the side of it. I don't actually know, but if that's the case, then the shaft of the mine was probably in line with this, either up on the hillside over there, because you're not going to make the cable go around corners. Not much left to see, is there, for what was once the deepest mine shaft in the world? So here's why I think the 1.4 kilometre depth of the new Chum Railway mine was actually an amazing engineering feat. The first miners came here, they started mining at shallow depths, and they used things like hand winches to pull the ore out. But to go deeper than that, you needed better technology. And it's almost like the industry had to invent the way it works. The Industrial Revolution was underway, and new technologies and new techniques were coming in all over the world. And it was sort of the combination of stuff that was coming together here in Bendigo that let them go deeper than anyone else had. So the very first mining here was done in vertical shafts. Bendigo's a very flat area, so there's not many of that sort of into the side of the hill mining. It's almost all vertical, and all the big mines were vertical shaft. The first thing they would be doing is little hand winches, which you'll see a little drum like this and a rope around it, and this is a bit of a drum here. This lever turns in a bigger circle than the drum, so it gives you a mechanical advantage so you can pull things up and down. Now, that's fantastic for mining 4, 5, 6, maybe 10 metres if you're feeling game. It's also something Barry and two of his mates can put together on a weekend. So the resources needed aren't enormous. The effort needed is not enormous. But the limitation is how far you can actually mine. The next level in technology that seems to have been used here was the horse-drawn winds. And what they had was they had a frame that stood up. And you see a lot of these in the early photos of Bendigo. And there was a pole that went right through the middle here to the ground. And up here was a great big drum with planks on it, planks of wood. It spins around in a circle. Down here's a crossbeam. That hooks up to a horse. I probably shouldn't draw a horse, but there's a horse. Now, you get two cables coming off this. Well, actually, it's one cable that comes in, is wrapped around, and comes out the other side. They go to a cleave wheels, 2 sets of cleave wheels on a frame. And then they go there and down your mine shaft. This is a headstock or a poppet head. Now, the idea is with two on one cable is there's going to be a bucket on either side of these, and the buckets weigh each other out. So basically it neutralizes the weight. It means the horse has to do less work to move things up and down if they're only one. And you see quite a few of these sort of operations. There's limitations to how far you can move with that, because as it goes down, you're still pulling the whole weight of the cable. So when this bucket's right at the top of the shaft, and this one's down the bottom, poor horsey still has to pull the weight of the whole cable. So it still has to do a lot of work. There's only so far you can go here, plus whatever's in the bucket, don't forget. Next step, steam technology, Industrial Revolution was coming. It eventually came to Bendigo. Initially, it was too expensive for a lot of mining operations because those engines had to be imported, usually from Europe. But the tyranny of distance meant it was costly to produce, and it gave opportunity for local manufacturers to step in. And pretty soon we were actually building all of this technology here on the goldfields because it was simpler and cheaper to do it here than it was to bring it from overseas. So there was actually a huge manufacturing base here supporting this industry. Before long, there were steam engines operating the goldfields, and to go to the sort of depths that the new Chum Railway mine did, you've got to have a steam engine. The lift, the hoist, is the choke point for the whole operation. Everything has to be moved up and down. Water, people, soil, or whatever it is comes through that lift. How fast that lift operates and how powerful it is and how much it can move in one go dictates how efficient the whole mining operation is. So steam came in, they started hoisting things up and down. But even then, you needed a powerful engine to operate down to the sort of depths these mines were. So cable alone, if they use a 2-inch cable, that equates to about 11 kilos a meter, right? So to operate a lift that's 1.4 kilometers into the ground means you're lifting 15.5 ton of cable alone when this is at its full extreme, remembering all the weights on one side. Then you add, say, a bailing bucket, a great big bucket for taking water out of the shaft. There's probably 1.5 tons in that, plus its volume of water. So you're looking at 17, 18 ton being lifted up here. You're not going to do that with horses. You need a steam engine. One of the terrifying thoughts about these buckets was because the speed limited the mine operation, they were used fast. And they talk about these things operating at like 6 meters a second. So quite phenomenal speed. All of this was lined with timber. So the shaft on its way down, easy enough to dig a hole, but it had to be lined with timber. Now, you can't obviously put timber in the side of a shaft and then dig under it because it's going to fall down on you. So it had to be pinned into the wall with timber all the way down the shaft. If you have a 2 by 6 meter shaft, wide shaft opening, every meter of depth you need 24 square meters of timber planks just on the edge to shore it up, plus the struts, plus the frame for the lift. To do 1.4 kilometers, it's actually going to take around 33,600 square meters of timber just to line that vertical shaft, let alone the reinforcements, let alone the framework for the lift to run in, let alone the tunneling out to the side. The number of trees that went into these mine shaft is phenomenal. If you look at old pictures of Bendigo, there's not a tree anywhere. We must have cleaned the forests for 100 kilometers to get these mines operating. Anyway, sorry environmentalists, but it's probably the truth. Another problem you have is once you're past the first 20 meters, the temperatures underground are pretty consistent. Every 40 meters you go down, the temperature increases by about 1 degree. Well, the time you get past 1 kilometer in depth, your operating environment's 35, 40 degrees temperature. At 1.4 kilometers, the depths these really deep mines are running, it's in the high 40s. So you're going down a mine to work in a fairly poor oxygen environment. 40 something degrees and it's humid because the next problem is water. There's a natural water table in the soil which varies seasonally and changes with the mining operations and other bits and pieces, but once you get below that, water starts to seep into the mine. And the more tunnel you have and the deeper you go, the more water seeps into the mine, and all the tunnels that go off to the side, water seeps into, collects, and it has to be pumped out. Miners don't work well underwater, as we've discovered the hard way many times. So it has to be cleared out of the mine. What most commonly was done, it seems on the goldfields here in Bendigo, was they had a bailing bucket. So they put a big bucket on one side of the shift, or maybe both sides of the lift. It would go right down the bottom of the shaft into a sump, a little pool where it collects. It would grab the water, they would hoil it up, empty at the top, and swap around. And sometimes they could be doing that on both sides of the lift, sometimes just one, sometimes just when they needed to. Now, the pumping, the dewatering of the shafts was fine when we had lots and lots of shafts in close proximity. And that's probably one of the things that actually allowed us to mine so deeply in Bendigo. There were lots of operators across a small area. It meant the water pumping was shared across every organisation. The trouble was, as the higher level gold, the cheaper to get gold, started to disappear, a lot of these other mining operations started to close down. They just weren't economical anymore, leaving the bigger operations to take on more and more of that water pumping. And that's what happened to the new Chum Railway in the end. They got down to an incredible depth, 1.4 kilometres, but they found good gold down there, but it wasn't economical to get it out. It was gold that would have been very profitable at a higher level. Their problem was the water was filling the mine quicker and quicker as the operations around them were shutting down and less pumping was being done by other companies. And they just couldn't afford to do it. So before they abandoned it, they noted at one point they were actually bailing water for up to 20 hours every day. So I imagine that means putting a baling bucket on both sides of the winch, running it flat out for 20 hours, and that would give them 4 hours worth of mining at that depth. And it just wasn't profitable. They had to abandon the venture. They had to abandon the lower levels of the mine and give them up to water. They continued to operate at the higher levels for a while, but eventually, basically, that became unprofitable and that mine shut down. So I said there were two mines in Bendigo that held the title of deepest in the world. After the New Chum Railway mine ceased its deep operations, another mine, and along the same reef, along the New Chum Reef, but at the other end, actually pushed deeper than they had and became the deepest mine shaft in the world. Now, the real question is, we know a lot of these mines are interconnected, so could you walk along the reef line between the two mines underground and go from one to the other? Let's have a look. Okay, so here's quite a late map of the New Chum Reef. And this was actually put together as part of a proposal to set up draining at either end of the reef at New Chum Railway mine and the Victoria Quartz Company, the two deepest shafts. As you imagine, the water tends to pull in the deepest ones. So they wanted the government to help them set up some drainage in those to keep the whole reef open, essentially. Electricity was coming in, electric pumping was an option. There were options that weren't open when most of these shafts were getting sunk. They wanted some help to do this. Any case, this is the Bellevue mine, and you can actually get right over here and still make this journey. So from here, we can go through this stope here and across and up. Now we're in the Eureka mine. Now there's a great big young chum reef here, open stope, you can get across through to that. Now we're in the upper levels of the New Chum Railway mine. Just to keep things interesting, you might as well catch the lift down way down here into the heat and the humidity, and now you're 2,800 feet underground. And we can get across on this stope through here, and we've made it to the new Sheridan Company at the other side of the railway line. Now, straight leg across here, don't even have to climb anything, and you're in the Shamrock Company mine. This is not connected, but they've measured it, and they're proposing it, I think, to help drain this shaft here. So you're going to have to climb a ladder or catch the lift up to this level, which looks like it's the 1,881 foot level. And then there's a bit of a stopey thing going on here. It's a bit odd, but you can get across through here. And now you're in the Garibaldi mine. You'll notice these two don't make it anywhere near that depth. You can go straight across from this one into the New Chum Consolidated mine. Short drop down and across again, and you are in the New Chum United mine. Now, you've only got one option here, which is this one, 2,000 and something feet. The Lancel, 222 mine. Another one that belonged to George Lancel. Up a dodgy ladder, up the hoist, and you can get across on several levels here. There was obviously some cooperation going on here. And suddenly you're now in the Lazarus mine. Straight across again, you're in the Old Chum mine. One of the oldest here, but still quite deep. Saddle down through here, dodgy ladder across New Chum and Victoria mine. Down here, one more dodgy ladder, and you're in Lancel's 180 mine. Very, very profitable mine. It says here connected by stopage, so you might as well do it that way. In here, climb some ladders, over some rocks, go around, probably very hard, across into the mine here, and you've reached our destination, the Victoria Quartz Company mine. This is the one that then became the deepest shaft in the world when it dug a bit deeper and passed New Chum Railway mine. We'll get into that in a sec. You'll notice though, these mines weren't that celebrated in Bendigo, and part of the thing was there were actually a lot of mines operating at this sort of depth. And you can see on this chum reef here, New Chum Reef, there's multiple mines that are over 3,000 feet in depth. They say there was about 11 mines in Bendigo that were operating at these sort of depths, so pretty amazing. If you had a list of probably the 20 deepest mines in the world, Bendigo would feature pretty highly in that list. We'd probably have 5 or so in there, I would suspect. Don't actually have the information to make sure about that, but that's what I would think. This is the Victoria Quartz Mining Company site on Victoria Hill. We're 2.5 kilometres away. I've actually covered this in another video, so I won't go into a heap of detail, but come and have a look. So, as a fluke of numbers, and on Google Earth, I discovered that here to the Sacred Heart Cathedral, the spiral, roughly, is 1.4 kilometres. About halfway through the church, not actually the spiral. So that is a sort of surface visualisation, the depth of the mine. I'll try and show you on the drone. So here, one of the things they do have is this old miner's cage. So this is the sort of stuff they would use to move all the equipment, all the timber, all the men up and down the mine shaft. So 4 people would travel on one of these. They're a bit smaller than I were. Well, still am. This mechanism at the top with it spring in the middle of it is a tension. I don't know the correct name for it, but what happens is basically if the cable's to fail for whatever reason, the tension comes off the spring and it pushes out these things on the side to jar into the wood there and hopefully slow and stop the descent. But yeah, I have a lot of faith in some old steel and timber. Pretty cool though. That's original, I'd imagine. It certainly looks old enough. So the mine was operating in 1910 down to the 4,228 foot level. They got a 1 for £1 funding grant from the government to extend a shaft down up to another 1,000 feet underground, which would have taken them past 5,000 feet, which is quite remarkable. That was done as what I think was a smaller shaft off to the side rather than extending the main shaft, which would have been cheaper. So I think it was primarily just for exploration, but I don't really know. That seems to have been extended to about 4,614 feet, when on the 14th of June 1910, suddenly the water influxing into the shaft increased dramatically. Thinking it was a temporary influx, which apparently wasn't uncommon, the boring machine and other equipment had been left down at the lower levels, now submerged. The mine continued 24-hour operations trying to remove water from the shaft, but it continued to rise. They brought the now closed Lancels 180 mine, which was the next mine, back online and started bailing water from that mine as well. By halfway through the next month, these mines and Lancels 222 mine, the New Chum Consolidated and Lazarus mine were all desperately trying to pump water out of the shafts, knowing full well that the future of deep mining on this reef was at stake. But to no avail, they weren't able to keep up with the influx of water. The water seemed to be coming from the southern end, and at the time it was thought it might actually be a direct consequence of the cessation of bailing at the New Chum Railway mine. In the end, they couldn't clear the water, it just kept coming in. They were pumping around 900,000, almost 1 million litres of water a day, but it wasn't enough. They had to abandon the lower levels. They worked the upper for a bit in the Quartz mine, but that had to be given up, and the mine closed after about 50 years of operation.